Welcome to Modern Mythology, a podcast that explores the many intersections of story and system. In every episode, we will discuss some facet of how RPGs function as modern myths, providing a shared canvas for creativity and the collaborative discovery of new worlds. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net. Episode 4, Agency.
Cut my laughter.
No, you're not allowed to laugh on this podcast. serious business.
Would we be serious?
Oh, that's something we can get to actually either in this episode or another one about seriousness. And we've had some discussions about that. Because there's different ways of kind of interpreting it. Obviously it's a game, so it's play, but at the same time, it's not a joke. But you can joke when you're playing.
Right. It has to be organic. I don't like groups who are looking for the laugh or looking for the punchline. We have had games,
improv comedy, basically.
We have had Torchbearer games where we were just crying. And
not the Torchbearer games. We're almost crying out of food.
But
I can't see anything.
Right. As with everything that we talk about, it's a dichotomy.
Right.
It's a continuum. Continuum. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about player agency.
Yep.
And this is a big one. I feel like we have a lot to say about it. I don't want to approach the podcast to be like, this is bad GMing and this is good GMing, right? Or this is a bad game. Or this
so much is
contextual
to the group that's doing it. But there are things that kind of generally work and generally don't work. But there's no hard rules.
I think it's kind of interesting that we're looking at a book that got recommended by Ginni D in her podcast and her YouTube channel. And it's called The Game Master's Handbook of Proactive Role-Playing. And I thought it was an interesting conversation. You and I have been talking about the evolution of these ideas and how they haven't really changed. We were talking about I came across them in the early 2000s, right?
Mm-hmm.
And GMs are still having these conversations. But I think the back cover, the headline is your role playing in a rut? And I think that's an interesting idea in terms of us talking about good and bad, right? Is a lot of times people just do what they're going to do until they're bored or until there's a problem.
Yeah. This is a big part of archetypical play, I feel like. It's on the one hand, an archetype gets you in the door with kind of knowing the default thing that your character is or does, or the setting, kind of archetype, same sort of thing. But then the next question, and it's as important, probably even more important, is what's the way that it's different from every other instance of that thing? So it's you kind of balance those two things, because it's you want it similar enough that you know what you're kind of getting into, but at the same time, what's different. And you get bored if you keep doing the same thing over and over again.
Right. Right. You got to mix it up. And I'll be honest, there's times when I'm in the middle of a campaign, I'll run what I like to call a video game simulation, where the players start in a very sort of board game-esque. Hordes of creatures are just coming at them. They find that when they get killed, they just respawn and just go back to basics, because all of this heavy role-playing, goal-oriented, immersion, you need a break, right? So while that can sometimes be kind of the mainstay of a lot of people's games, I'll even go back to
or a dungeon crawl, as long as everyone's in for the dungeon crawl,
right?
Right.
And so I want to point out something Monte Cook said in a description of how to run Invisible Sun. He was this is not likely the way you run games, and I'm going to ask you to think differently, right? Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you to think about running your game differently. Now, what he described is how I run all my games, but that's the point is, I think important is we want to be better GMs. We want to be better players. We want our games to be elevated. In that we want to keep it fresh. We want week in and week out and convention, month after month or whatever the case is, to have this be a skill that we're fostering, right? And, while it's very easy to be like, well, my green game's great and we all have fun and blah, 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 that's fantastic. Then, there's a small part of me that questions why you're listening to these things. But, I hope that you're going to pull something from this. I hope that you're going to try some new things. And, before we start, I want to say, through all of this stuff, make sure you communicate with your players what you're doing. Like you said, as long as they know that they're doing a dungeon crawl.
And we'll say again and again, buy-in is important. Buy-in can be implicit, especially if you know the people well enough for it actually to be implicit. But
sometimes you could surprise them. Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah,
but it's always been a bad time when the GM does the, a whole plot line and just and then I wake up. Right?
Well, that's true in a novel too, right? TV series, yeah.
Right? If you want your players or your, don't get me wrong, every once in a blue moon it works, and it only works,
especially if
when it doesn't.
It works also if it's if you wake up, but then there's something that you got from that, the character got from that, or you got from that changed.
Right.
If it's you woke up and that means everything that happened before that point is null, then it's why did I engage with anything that happened before that?
Right. And that really comes to the crux of what this episode is about, is why is that a problem? That problem is because the players don't feel like they had any control. Right? Because it feels like everything that they did was for naught. Right. And I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of players who feel like that in their games.
Yeah. One example that comes up a lot, and a lot of DMs use this as a sort of don't ever do this sort of thing, but is a player characters getting captured. Because that strips away the character's agency. And don't do that. But I found that can definitely work. It's just that it has to be, there's a couple elements to it that are pretty critical. And one of them is the buy-in of sort of knowing that if your characters, especially if your characters are captured in a way where you didn't do something really dumb to get yourself in that situation, where you trust the DM as a game, you're captured, okay, you've all been executed, you can't, or whatever it is that your arms have been chopped off, your character, been irrevocably changed. And you didn't have any sort of engagement in that. That's
you lost all your stuff, right?
Yeah.
So
even then, that can work, but there has to be the chance to either get it back, something that drives the story forward, and isn't just you're punishing them for no apparent reason.
Or sometimes you're punishing, a GM's punishing them because they got too powerful. Because sometimes GMs use this as a means to shake things up and so on and so forth, which is in its own right a good impulse, right? But with some players that can really backfire.
Yeah. And my strategy on that is give them the things they want, but more power, more problems. You got all this gold from the Queen's treasury or whatever, and now everyone knows about that.
Right.
That's going to be a problem.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to work from sort of what I conceive of the most rudimentary concepts of control that players have, down to almost a GM-less sort of perspective. This is kind of where we're going. And we said we find our sweet spot somewhere in the middle.
Right. Yeah, usually in the middle somewhere.
Yeah.
Or even going back and forth.
Because I love prepless games, right? I live and die.
I'm more of the prep, right. Loving prep, because I'm more of a writer at heart, where it's I'm not trying to control the story in that way, but I like to be prepared. And D&D or whatever RPG I'm playing at the time is kind of a way of getting myself out of my comfort zone.
Right.
Because my comfort zone is knowing in advance everything.
Right. So part of what we're going to also talk about is how do you manage those balances, right? Mm-hmm. Without robbing you of your fun as a GM, right? Again, we'll reiterate, GM is a player too, right? So you need to have fun. and like where you might fall as a GM, and quite honestly, where you might see yourself, where you could try different things, maybe jump around a little bit, right? Cool. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is characterization, right? Where, somebody who talked about this recently was the podcast Sword and Waistcoat, where he kind of calls this descriptive agency. And it seemed a little rudimentary to me in the beginning, but then I recognized that there are a lot of players who still are in the process of, I hit it, or I use insert name of power here.
We're looking on the sheet kind of like, what can I do?
And roll, and roll the dice.
Yeah.
And there are GMs who, as we're coining the phrase, I'm telling you, I'm going to make it a thing, a cult of personality GMs, where they are describing all of the action, right? They're describing your reaction, they're describing the NPC's reaction and everything in between.
Sometimes the NPCs talking to each other.
Oh, God.
Sometimes you get stuck into that. No matter how you're running a game, you're like, oh, no.
And we'll talk a little bit about that later on, the idea of NPCs having goals, and that's great. But make sure your NPCs don't ever have to have conversations. And there are ways to do that. It happens, but there's good ways to do that the players can be involved.
Right.
Do you have anything you want to include, but other than like this, the most rudimentary?
We start out in this sort of continuum sort of thing and kind of sketch out the two sides of it, and then I'll push back against that because it's my way.
Sure. So characterization is your ability to play your character. Now, I've often said the thing that I hate most is players saying, well, I was just playing my character as a means to behave poorly, right?
Yeah, so the last part of that is the thing that really...
Right. But every opportunity for the player to interact is an opportunity for them to display characterization, for them to say who their character is.
In third person or first person. I think that's a lot of people have the sense that you have to do it in first person for it to be in character. And I don't think that's
Right. And even just how they fight, right? I mean, combat is a foundational part of role playing, right? A lot of
most systems.
A lot of your my games have very little combat, but it happens, and
it was a big eye-opening thing for me when I recognized that the conflict is the crux, not combat. Combat's a form of conflict. But when you have a system like D&D where half of the rule books or more are based on combat, you're going to be doing a lot of combat. Yeah. That's what the system is.
And and one of the themes to the podcast being that mechanics inform what this game is going to be about. And so if you look at say Call of Cthulhu, right, and understand of like what is a game really about, you can really learn a lot by what percentage of the book goes towards that.
Right.
And you would be surprised in a game that a lot of people consider very role-playing oriented, right? Call of Cthulhu. It's basically about running and screaming, has a lot of combat in it, which is weird because you don't generally want to fight most of the shit in that book.
Yeah. I think in a way it's one of those sort of implicit assumptions that kind of got baked into RPGs from its kind of early origins and wargaming and whatnot. Right. And like it's stuck around in a lot of cases up to the present day.
Yeah. Well, and some games that make sense in terms of like even World of Darkness, you have the opportunity to play epic badasses, right? Like these fucking vampire lords or werewolves or gun nuts, right? Delta Green, another good example. Totally makes sense that there's a significant combat chapter in Delta Green, right? You're all playing like Black Ops, like super badasses who then have to face extension horrors, but we digress as usual. Anyway, so I just, this is just a simple idea. And, I hope anybody listening to this, if you don't quite get the idea, just the player should be the one to describe their actions. They shouldn't be describing what the outcomes are, but they should be describing
their intentions.
Their intentions.
That's how I would frame it, yeah.
Their intentions, their flair, their mannerisms while they're doing it. Are you screaming? Are you quiet? Even a conversation can be, well, you don't want too much exposition. And obviously, funny voices is a thing, right? Mm-hmm. But in conversations, how are you holding yourself? There's got to be body language that maybe the character has, right? And you can use these opportunities, But then we're going to talk about something in terms of characterization as to are there times when it's appropriate that the character is not in control of themselves?
Right. I would say yes. And actually, a situation happened in a previous episode when we did the little Chronicles of Darkness run through. We didn't get a chance to fully use it because it was only in one scene, but Mark's character got a condition where basically the outcome is that at some point the storyteller can take over their character for part of the scene. I can't remember the conditions for it, but that was a condition. And I think that sort of thing can really work. Obviously, you want to do it in a way that kind of hopefully doesn't make the player want to kill you. Where it's, it's something bad for the character. But I mean, that's a whole other element of this is, the kind of stories you can tell really open up when players recognize that something bad happening to their character can very well move the story forward and actually be a good thing as a player. It's not always my character gets wealth and riches and gets everything they want and their intentions always come out. There's that an interesting story? Not usually. I mean, it can be for a moment, but what happens next is
right. And I kind of like the idea. Now we're going to talk about some of this other stuff more thoroughly in a bit, but I like this idea of the roles adjudicating sometimes when you don't control your character, right?
Even the dice rolls themselves.
Here's a good example in my own personal life, right? I struggle with procrastination. And at some point in time, while I hope that your characters, the players in your games, never face this situation, the question becomes, do I get up and do the dishes or do I sit and watch television? We're not going to get into what my therapist would say about all of that stuff, but the point being is that we're not always necessarily in control, and the dice and the GM can sometimes develop that characterization through failures. And I think that's where virtues and vice and stuff.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Virtues and vice in Chronicles, especially the new version of Chronicles of Darkness, it's very much your vice would be staying on the couch and watching TV. And if memory serves, you would still get one willpower from that. But if you did the dishes and it was something that actually was pushed against it and actually worked against you somehow, I'm not sure how that would happen with doing the dishes, but then you would get all your willpower back.
Yeah. And you have vices that you have a lot of control over, but you have vices in Blades, right? That if you excise them, right, you're necessarily not doing the right thing, but you explore those vices, then you get stress back. Of course, the most famous loss of control is sanity in Call of Cthulhu, and a lot of Lovecraftian ideas. Coriolis has stress. Burning Wheel has probably the single mechanic that drew me to it, which is that bodies hate the interaction between flesh and steel. And if you get stabbed, there's a very likely chance you're just going to run away. It's something called hesitation, and you have to make a steel roll. It's literally called the steel roll. And if you fail, you might curl up into a ball, or you might run away screaming, or whatever.
I mean, this is true. I mean, there are breaking points in Chronicles of Darkness, but for the most part, most RPGs don't really have a baked-in system for the reality of I don't know what the stat is, but in warfare, a lot of soldiers in the situation can't fire. They freeze up, and it's natural. I mean, that's there's a reason. So but in an RPG, it's kind of my character's the hero, and he's always or he she whatever does the thing.
And so now there's this interesting juxtaposition of characterization, and And agency also, I'm going to try to frame this, right? Because let's look at the movie Wonder Woman, right? And one of the characters, I forget the character's name, but Brennan McGregor, I believe is the actor's name, right? He's the Scottish fellow. He's a sharpshooter. And there's a point in time where there's another sniper and he turns and he goes to fire and he just can't do it, right? And then they sort of explain to Wonder Woman, to Diana, that he's just lost his nerve, right? Like the war, whatever the case is, he maybe at one point in time had it and now he doesn't. Now the question there ends up being, it's a movie, we get that, but in the context of a role-playing game, did the sniper's player make that decision,
right,
or was it a failed roll?
Right. Right. It would be a really interesting way of kind of interpreting a failed roll in the narrative rather than, you shoot high or whatever.
Right. Now, I would think that as a player, I would be initially kind of annoyed if the GM took over and that was what happened from my failed roll. It's one thing.
I don't think.
The one thing to be like, oh, you miss, or like, don't get me wrong, it's interesting. Mm-hmm. But if I'm like trying to be this shit hot sniper, right? And now the GM has just said, oh no, this happens to him a lot of time. Right.
If that's not something that's been established for the character, then yes, that's kind of really the thing for me anyway, personally in a game. If the character was already struggling with that thing, I'd be kind of like that the storyteller introduced that. Whereas if it was like out of nowhere, then I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Now, and there is some groups and some players and some GMs who would turn that around and be like, why did you fail?
Right.
And that can be a great opportunity, right? Don't think that all of the innovation, all of the story, everything has to come from a GM, right? Even all of the failures. Like, let your players fail. Let them. Now, there's a lot of conversation about whether or not metagaming is a good thing or a bad thing.
Right.
And
or even what that means.
Or what that means. I think you and I can commonly sort of frame it in terms of making decisions about the game that's not in the game, right? You're making decisions because you think it's going to be good story is the most common one.
Right.
You're making decisions. A very common one is what happens to that character because the player doesn't show up, right? That's kind of a metagame consideration. You can do some really interesting
things with that too. I found.
Absolutely. Invisible Sun is my favorite, where this idea of the shadow, and whenever a player isn't there, often you've gone into shadow. Your brain sort of retreated into this quasi like illusionary space where you're living this different life and you forget you're a powerful magic user, you know?
Yeah, in 2054, the hacker character should say, the player couldn't make it. And of course the other players knew that, but they're like in character, like, he didn't show up at our meeting. We can't reach him. This is weird. And so like, I'll kind of, the B story of that whole session was really kind of like, where's Prospero? What's going on? And it became like an ongoing part of the plot,
Yeah.
But it wasn't in a way, like when he kind of like between sessions, I talked to him. I was like, so where was Prospero? And kind of told him about it.
Yeah.
And he played into that, and it was a cool addition. Whereas it could have been just kind of like, he vanished,
right?
And no one cares.
There have been I will be the first to admit that I've done some quote unquote bad GMing in my life, where if you didn't show up at sessions, bad shit happened to you. Like you were always the victim of whatever. Like you got kidnapped, you got whatever.
Well, speaking of cult of personality,
yes, totally a thing. And my players were okay with it. I would probably say, because quite honestly, we didn't know any better. But I think a lot of players now would really
I probably wouldn't do that.
Yeah,
at least not without talking to them about it.
But so you have to give your players an opportunity to fail, right? Is what I'm proposing, that all of the failure, all of the successes don't necessarily have to come from you. And maybe I think some of these always think of whatever happens as an opportunity for characterization, for role playing, for somebody to further the plot, further their own ideas of what happens, right? And I will tell you that I would say my answer to the metagaming question is almost 90% positive. I think there are
a lot of good instances of metagaming.
Yeah. But a lot of people really buck against that idea, right?
Yeah.
It's really, I've heard it used as slurs in some like LARPs and stuff.
I mean, the kind of case where I think it's negative is where you're using your kind of outside of the game perspective or your understanding of the rules, not to like play the rules as they are, but to bend it, in your favor in a way that doesn't kind of contribute to what you're trying to create, the story, where something about how traps work in the world. So, every 5 feet you got your 10-foot pole. And I know that's, a thing, but
it is totally a thing, right? Let me tell you an anecdote of where the 10% lies, right? I was playing in a vampire LARP and I was one of the Giovanni. The game was running kind of slow. And I just basically was like, let's go raid somebody. Mm-hmm. We're badass mafia members. I was part of the Cappadocians. Let's just go do something. We're going to raid. We're going to go do something. All of us are like, this is a great idea. We all stand up to go. And this one kid was just sitting there. Mm-hmm. And I was like, are you coming? You're going? He's like, no, I'm just here to collect XP. That's all he was there for, is just to get enough XP to get whatever discipline that he could, And I was like, oh boy. So anyway, anything else you want to add to characterization? Quite honestly, that was more about characterization than I expected us to really talk about.
I mean, there's so many kind of ways that it can be done, but it's hard to kind of draw specific examples off the top of my head. That's kind of how it kind of go. We'll probably return to these topics again and again in different forms.
We will, because a lot of these are going to build on each other.
Yeah.
So the second category of agency is what I call action, right? And this is, there's a couple ways to do this. So first off, let me give you an example of where a GM is taking action agency, right? It's when a GM writes into the adventure, or a publisher writes into the adventure. In order to succeed at this thing, you need to make this skill roll at a certain level.
Right.
Now, sometimes that's implicit, right? Sometimes you can write into a venture, by the way, this lock is this difficult. Right? However, I would probably say what would be better is approaching something like, this door is as a certain difficulty, right?
So what would the distinction be there between door and lock?
Well, the difference is that roll would be about the same, whether somebody wants to burst it, break it down, light it on fire, pick it, use magic to pass through the door. The door more has sort of a narrative constraint than a physical constraint. Of course,
makes sense.
This is the difference between simulationism and gamism or narrativism, right? In that simulationism says this door has such and such thickness and is made of this material.
It's this strong against fire and it's this strong against bullets.
Right. I don't have a lot of use for that kind of thought process in a game. It can get kind of silly, in my opinion.
I think, if at best it serves the purpose of trying to create a similitude of reality, but just enough that you buy into it. It's like movie logic, it's like, if, your character's running along, somebody start flying and there's no reason that, that breaks your suspension of disbelief. But you don't need to have every single law of physics implicit in the game for it to be believable as a story, right?
And it's not only onerous, but it also it just slows things down, because you know, and some players really like that because then they like that their real world knowledge can kind of come into effect.
I played with a lawyer. I mean, like a literal lawyer who I guess was also a rules lawyer in a way, but that's just how we thought about things. Is like these are the, you know, so it was very, it was an interesting experience, learning experience anyway.
And there is a school of thought for that kind of playing. And again, some of that can be really fun, right? Don't get me wrong. If you have as a GM, a good sense of those things.
Yet again, buy-in. If it's one player in the group who's that way.
It doesn't work. But by and large, you know, we're both, I think, very narrative oriented, right? So we're thinking about more, why is someone getting past the door than the door being an obstacle in its own right. You know, the door is an obstacle, but is a narrative obstacle, not a physical obstacle, right? Yeah. I always use the example of I don't care how you get over the wall. I care why you want to get over the wall, right? If you're just getting over the wall just as flavor, then just get over the wall. If you have to do it in a timely fashion to do something,
right,
then that's the important part, right? You know, so that's the core idea that I'm talking about, is where the GM is establishing ostensibly the how, right? What is the action going to look like? Now, some of that bleeds over to characterization, but sometimes the other end of the spectrum are games that the assumption is you're always going to use the thing you're best at. Right? I'm going to use my engineering skill to hit somebody. Right? Because I've made something, or it's a wrench, or, you know, and it's a very common trope of like, this is the flavor by which I do all things, because we're always going to do things based on what the
character is good at.
Right.
You know, unless if you're trying to, you know, if you're stuck in a situation where you can't do something you're good at. So,
right.
Which is another form of agency, I guess. You know, like kind of control of agency, of putting the player or the characters in a situation where you know that their skills are not actually adapted to that situation. How are they going to, you know, although you do want to think ahead of it, not just putting them in a corner where they can't go anywhere, because that's not interesting. But definitely when you have a group of very, very competent characters who are very competent at very specific things, you can definitely find situations where it's like, you know, as an example, the 2054 crew lost their hacker, and this was a different time than, you know, I mentioned before. And suddenly they went, and they were in a city they're not used to. They went to Beijing, and they couldn't. They had like, how do we get a cab? Oh shit! And like the hacker had the money, and like, so it was just like just very basic things for like most people. These like hyper competent in very specific ways, people like had to struggle, and it was a fun session for that. You know, big change of pace for them, you know, being a sort of like super spies.
How the hell cab? That's great. That's awesome. So, and there's a couple pieces of this. So the first thing is, of course, what skills you use, how the characters go through the world. Are they highlighting the things that they're good at? Or like you said, there's a little bit of a simulationism here where you're like, or is it set in the world that this is this way? Right? Now, a lot of times what I like to do is sort of allow players to approach the game as they want to, where sometimes like when they fail, that's when then they have to approach the world otherwise. A good example is Burning Wheel. Burning Wheel is a very, very deadly combat system. Most people in Burning Wheel don't want to fight. And so a lot of times you're trying to talk your way out of stuff. And we found that with our buddy in Torchbearer, where we came upon a hill giant, right? And the hill giant was going to be this really significant challenge for this.
It's kind of out of our class.
Right. And this is not a fighting group, right? This is a bunch of nerds that are
shaman. Thank you
deciding to like dungeon crawl. And this is like a real advantage to Torchbearer, is that the first thing that one of the main characters decides to do is talk to the hill giant, is basically convince the hill giant to join them.
Right.
I will say I did not expect
I know
the adventure I had just decided that there would be now a hill giant with them going.
But I did like that we still, you still use the conflict rules where you doing the cards and like figuring out what kind of actions you take and stuff. It wasn't just okay, charisma check, boom, okay,
yes,
it works, it doesn't work.
Oh, I love social conflict systems.
Right.
Obviously, Torchbearer and Mouseguard are my probably all-time favorite as like a spin-off to the Burning Wheel sort of method of exchanges and doing that. I love that. I love the interaction between there's a little metagame going on there. So like, what is this person going to play?
It's like a card game inside of
there's a little card game inside of I absolutely
I like it too once I got a hang of it. I feel like it's a little confusing at first, especially with that flow chart where you're just like looking at all these arrows and you don't know what's going on. But
but I like it because there's some gamism in there, and that on one hand you're learning how to do this thing and it's a skill. And I love the idea that I'm good at Burning Wheel combat. Like, I love this concept, yet the combats are still very evocative and not one-sided, But it is a system that you have to engage with, right? Some of these systems, you have to be willing to engage with it to learn how to play them well to tell the good story.
Yeah.
Right? So one of the pieces of this equation that I have taken to heart is, as a GM, I no longer roll dice. It's just not a thing that I do anymore.
I will probably always hold on to that personally.
Sure, absolutely. And I'm sure there's lots of GMs who are listening to this and going to be like, what? That's crazy.
Just partially for like player reactions, just the look on people's faces when the DM like is talking and just rolls a die,
So there's been a couple of systems and reasons why I made this decision, right? The first is that GMs have a great deal of power to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, having the die be one way is a way to develop player agency and is also a way to balance the roles between players and GMs. Yes. And what it does for me is it creates this idea of stakes, of explicit stakes. Now, some games like Fate, right, or Dogs in the Vineyard, or a number of those kinds of games have stated explicit stakes, where what we were talking about before with the sharpshooter, right? Mm-hmm. There's a big difference between the GM saying you failed that roll and now it's in the game that sometimes you lose your nerve, right? It's another thing entirely for the GM to say, you can take that shot, but if you fail, it's because you lost your nerve. And you say that before the roll.
Right.
So that's one piece of that equation. And again, that's giving agency over to the player. Where in Burning Wheel, unlike Torchbearer, in Burning Wheel, the player then goes, I'm not taking that shot then. Like those stakes are too high for me.
Sure.
Right? Sometimes it's a negotiation. That's definitely
happened in Torchbearer with us too.
Well, in Torchbearer, the GM's not supposed to, you're not supposed to be able to say no. Once you commit in Torchbearer. Right.
Yeah. No, but I mean the situation, like not the situation.
But the stakes are also very different. So the stakes, so we go from, say, Burning Wheel, where your stakes are set ahead of time, or Fate, where your stakes are set ahead of time. But that's a good point that going to Torchbearer, it's different because Torchbearer, you have these explicit stakes that are part of all failures. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is in Torchbearer, either you succeed and get a condition, or you get a twist and need to then extend the roll on, right?
The grind is also part of what defines, I think, the things you're trying to avoid with that.
Right. You're like, oh, I don't necessarily know that I want to run into that because I'll progress the grind, but that's another thing entirely. So my point being is consider player agency in terms of now some GMs are going to scratch their head, and Jamie's been playing with me for you've been playing with me a long time now to understand how this works. But my adversaries, they are doing things simultaneously to when you are, right? Just to use combat as a perfect example. Usually what happens is I try to stab them, I fail, nothing happens. Now my adversary tries to stab me, he fails, nothing happens, right? First off, as a player, I hate that. As a player, I think that's just the worst set of contingencies and is in no way how I want to role play. Second piece ends up being, it didn't move the story forward, right? Those roles were superfluous. We didn't have to make them, and nothing actually happened in the narrative, right? Two people whiffing is
well, you don't know in advance you're going to whip.
Sure, but it might be funny, but it's not. I propose that every die roll should propel the story forward.
That's the goal anyway.
So the idea of getting into combat is, if I fail this exchange, now it's an exchange, right? It's not my sword swing and then your sword swing. We are swinging swords at one another.
Is this something you'd say you think about this way regardless of the system?
Regardless of the system. This is how I run fucking D&D now.
Right. I mean, it's just interesting to me because of your kind of, you oftentimes say, the system drives things and critical in that way. So it's just, that's interesting. But I mean, I feel that when I play with you. That you have that. So like, if you fail your roll, there is no chance nothing will happen. Know, if you fail this, you really want to roll this because if you fail, something is going to happen. Right.
I learned this from Apocalypse World. One of the first games that really introduced this idea was Apocalypse World. Because Apocalypse World, what they were saying is, okay, we talk about stake setting, right? But stake setting can break the immersion a little bit. So now we're going to have a list of things the GM is allowed to do. And that's very important. The GM's allowed to do.
That's definitely plays into agency. Yeah, for sure.
Right. And then it's like, you understand that if you fail this roll, here is all of the things they can do. They can fuck with other NPCs. They can do damage to you. They can change the state of the world. They can do various things. And there are even rules in there for escalating that. Like maybe not murder the dog the first failure. Maybe you swing your sword and it gets very close to your beloved pup. You might want to narratively figure out how to get the pup out of harm's way if you don't want the pup to get hit, in your next failure. It's a way, I feel, that just puts all of the control in the player's hands. They say how they're going to do things. They roll the dice. All I do is say what the consequences to that die roll are.
I think, with most of the groups of players, at least that I've played with you with, it's worked pretty well. But I have played with people who I think struggle with that. Some people kind of like to be told, I think, the story they're participating in, I haven't played enough convention games to really know if that's but I feel like that's kind of the setting where that would be more challenging, if they're not expecting that anyways,
Yeah. And when somebody might say like, okay, well, what about when there's an opposed roll, right? Well, two things either happen. First off, a lot of games use Cypher System as an example. You just have a set goal, right? A PC NPC is at a certain level. Right. You just have to beat their level, right? That's the opposition, right? The other, but if I really, really need a roll, if like the quality of what happens on the other side is important, I have another player roll. I won't roll. Right. I let them be the bad guy, not me. Right. One of our players notoriously rolls poorly. And so people are often jockeying, like, is he going to be the one who makes our roll for the group, or is he going to roll for the adversaries? Cool. any question, anything you want to add to the idea of like action agency? Anything that
I'm just wondering if the idea of like proactive versus reactive games from the book, proactive role playing, forgot the title of it, kind of how that, if you think that feeds into that.
So this is the next piece of the equation, right? Which is plot agency, right? So of course if you don't know what a railroaded game is at this point, good for you. You probably haven't been playing for a very long time. Right. Games that are rails don't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but often basically what they are is a game to whom you don't have as a player a lot of choices in terms of
it's the quintessential example of like quote unquote bad agency that's the element of it. It's not that the plot is on rails can work, but like if characters on choices are blinded in that way, then
right. It's often so a couple I can think. Can you think of any examples of railroaded games, like some of what happens in a railroad game? Or like a good example is, one rule of thumb: I will never have NPCs save the PCs ever. Right?
I've had that work. But it has to be in a way, it's kind of like Gandalf, right? Or like something like that, where like they can't be something that's like relied on. It's and it's something you can only use once or twice probably in a campaign. But it can be a big, the Eagles are coming, whatever kind of moment, if it feels right, and it's a contextual sort of thing. But I definitely had it worked once. But like I do agree that you definitely have to be careful with how often you use it, very much. So
yeah, I've definitely seen like NPCs who've just swooped in, like defeated all the monsters, and
right,
then
they assume that's going to happen again, kind of thing.
Or the players are just sitting around twiddling their thumbs. You know what I mean? Like
that. I would play that as a narrated thing. This is what happens. I wouldn't roll that out, certainly.
Right. Although I think in something like the Eagle, well, first off, right, you're questioning whether or not is Gandalf a PC or an NPC, right?
I will rule on that.
So if he's a PC, right, I agree with you. But if he's a PC, he casts that spell that summons the Eagles, right? If he's an NPC, he casts that spell that summons the Eagles. It's going to be part of the narrative. But now the conflict is, can we get away and onto the Eagles? Yes. Right? Yeah. Before we, so there's a difference between that scene in the bar fight in Firefly, where they're on the edge of a precipice. It's a pretty common idea where people are pushing them off a cliff, and then they kind of jump off the cliff only to, or in this case, they, Serenity comes up and, washes line of like, I'm going to make a new crater out of this little moon as like an intimidation attack. Now, if that happens as an NPC, it sort of deflates the whole concept, because of why did we have a conflict to begin with? What's another example? Another example is we were talking about before, NPCs talking to each other. Right now, if there's some sort of exposition, or if players are like eavesdropping, right, that could kind of work. But can you think of ways to sort of like diffuse that, or like make that kind of idea work, where if two NPCs have a conflict, how you can play that out?
I think the way I usually handle it, and maybe it's not the best way, I don't know, is to try to cut down on the sort of system side of it, and kind of not to rush through it, but to like treat it more like the at worst the quick cutscene kind of thing, where it's like, this is what's happening, but I do try to get players involved in it in some way by opening up the interaction to them, because they don't like being stuck just talking in NPC's voice for like too long,
Especially two different NPCs, and you're like, which one's which, and can we tell?
I'm not
do
like
we
a
need
voice
puppets
person
involved? I would, so in a game, something like, Burning Wheel, then, I would suggest going into a conflict, right? Going into a social conflict.
There's sometimes that makes sense. I guess other times it's more like I would it's kind of like the portion of how I'm stuck on Tolkien today of, Elrond's meeting where it's like, and many things were discussed, and it's basically kind of like cut over like the 3-hour conversation. I'm not going to like give you like the, if you're like at a meeting of all the powers or whatever kind of situation,
right.
You don't need to hear all of it.
Right. The other thing I've done is give the NPCs to the players. Mm. I've had situations where I'll like open up a scene of like a city council meeting and give everybody these little short PCs with goals and let them argue.
I've struggled with how they work, I think. And so it depends so much on the groups, where it's, I think sometimes players can get too worried about kind of like, am I saying the right thing for the character? Especially if it's a character who's like a political character who kind of has a place in the world. They aren't a throwaway character. Mm-hmm. It's like stepping into that role sometimes I think can be intimidating, but it depends.
Yeah. It can, and it works better with some groups, but mm-hmm. I say try it out, honestly, like try out handing NPCs over and letting them battle it out. So, no, I won't be involved. I'll step back. Here you go. Here's 2 characters. You get one. What do they want from this scene? Go, and let them do it. This particularly works well, again, if you have good, strong, systemic support for social interactions, right? So this book, Proactive Role-Playing, is about a couple things. It's actually a pretty interesting take on the whole perspective.
Yeah.
Right?
That was interesting.
There's things that I think I would almost say all good GMs do.
In some form, yeah.
In some form. I've seen a lot of online GMs. Obviously Ginni D, who actually wrote the foreword to this book. The How to Be a Great GM is you should look up. We'll put it in the show notes. Talks about all of the characters should have goals. This is something that I found very important in D&D. If you're not doing it in your games, honestly, I feel like you have to.
Yeah. Plus, goals and aspirations play in so well into the milestone approach.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I think for Invisible Sun, character arcs became such an integral part that Monte Cook actually created a supplement for adding character arcs to the rest of the Cypher System, which now, granted, he might have, planned that before or whatever, but it didn't exist in Cypher until he wrote Invisible Sun.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a big part of character is like, what's my motivation?
What's my motivation?
101 thing, right? Yeah.
When I think about characters in a novel, I have this process that I do, and I think we might have touched on it. I'm a planner. I'm not a pantser. I know exactly what's going on. I know what the arc is, Sometimes
depends on the story for me, but I'm definitely more of a planner.
Sometimes characters surprise me. Don't get me wrong.
Exactly. Sometimes you got to rewrite a whole thing. The character's like, no, I'm not doing that.
Right. But what I do is my characters are, who are they about, right? What are their internal goals or motivations? Right? Like, what's their general overarching motivation? What's their physical goal? What's the manifestation within the context of the story that they are physically trying to get to? And then what is stopping them? What are the obstacles? Normally are supporting characters, right? And then the last thing that's important is the epiphany. How do they change? Right. And I look at that over the course of the story of how every character changed, even sometimes supporting characters and villains. Right. I think that really adds, not to toot my own horn, but I think that really adds to the complexity and the depth of a story is all of these characters are changing.
Oh, they have to have, I definitely have to have motivations to be a character. And one good way to frame it, I think, is fears and desires. I mean, of course, you can use different words, but the basic Buddhist approach is where it's like motivation towards or motivation away from. And those things are intrinsically linked, ultimately. So, like you might not even have to sketch it out the way, but sometimes aspirations can be things you're trying to avoid. And I think that...
Right. Pain or pleasure. Right. Absolutely. So the beginning part of the book is about goals for factions and non-player characters, that everything is doing something for a reason. This is probably the most basic idea on how to avoid the orc in the random dungeon room problem.
Sure.
Right? Why is the orc there? What is the orc trying to get? How to be a better GM or how to be a great GM podcaster points out the idea of like, everybody should not be trying to fight to the death. Mm-hmm. Like, these are people with families. These are people with lives. They have aspirations. They have ideas of what they want to do. Sometimes you have zealots, and then those are going to be really dangerous.
Right. It actually makes them more intimidating when you play it that way.
Right. Right. Oh, he's just crazy. And then the authors go on to talk about creating proactive worlds of like locations, conflicts, and rewards, and then how to develop encounters. This is kind of a difficult idea too. Again, with plot, is like, all right, so you're sitting down and you like this part. So do I. Don't get me wrong, but you really like this part of developing.
Yep.
A scenario, world building, setting.
Yeah. It's a part of why I do it. Yeah.
So how then, what's your process, right? In terms of how do you make the characters the center stage to your world?
Well, the concept, especially when I'm doing an RPG on a book, the concept is pretty much always kind of framed around the characters, and one of the easiest ways is the group of misfits kind of trope. I mean, it usually comes out of a trope, and you hopefully figure out the ways that tropes can be changed, so it's not just cliche forever. But so you can have a million different versions of it, but it's like the Scooby Crew, and then so you're kind of building the setting out of the players too. I mean, I use those campaigns so much in examples because it was so much fun. But the 2054, the group were basically, the way they knew each other and kind of their way of engagement in that world was that they were hired as freelancers from this company who basically hired nerd divergent weirdos, pretty much, who were people who were really good at one thing or some things, but didn't. Yeah, exactly. And so the world building came first out of that corporation they were working for. Who were they? And then what's that connect to? And what's that connect to? And then kind of planning out around that. So a lot
of your development came out of a session zero.
Basically, or us kind of buying into it from the get-go, where it's we're playing this campaign, here's the concept, and everyone's like, I'm in, So it can come, usually it comes from me, but doesn't always.
Sure.
And usually there's some revision that happens where I have a concept, and then the group, kind of comes back with their kind of variation on it. And I try to, honor that. I'm not about this is my story and because then I wouldn't be doing an RPG. And part of the point is to right. to world build by I don't know the world. I want to know it. And if I sit in a room alone, I'm not going to world build the same way I'm going to if I'm playing with other people. Yeah, so
if your players are not the center of your game, you're doing it wrong. There's my hard line.
I was like, yes.
Anyway, so, all right. So let's look. We're looking at that and we say, all right, there's a session zero. Now, you actually in that game are doing a little bit of prep and you don't recognize it, or you do, in that you're saying we're setting this game in Hong Kong,
right,
in a cyberpunk future. So there's a conceit there, right? There's a lot of meat that goes into
assumptions,
what that means, right? Or if you're going to play Cyberpunk, you're playing Cyberpunk in 2077, just say in Night City.
Right.
That comes with a lot of world. What about something like your Witch Hunter series? Right? How do you do the development? Because the Witch Hunter series is your own world, right? And so now you have.
I mean, I treated 2054 like my own world, anyways, pretty much.
Sure, but it's still Hong Kong. Well, yeah, right? Like it's still there's still cars.
It's just like alternative, phones, you know. I mean, in the case of Witch Hunters, I mean, like again, shared assumptions were part of it. Like whereas like. You know, even if people aren't familiar with Alteron, you know, I can give them these sort of touchstones, like, you know, the movie Black Death, and I give, you know, a list of things. I don't remember off the top of my head, you know, that kind of put them in the same room. And then I gave them, you know, a little bit more world document than I do, you know, for in a lot of cases, like with 2054, where I, you know, kind of sketched out the different factions in the world. But then from there, it was really the same situation where I'm playing off of what they were doing, and you know, they kind of had this. They wanted to go with the group of misfits trope, but they kind of add this sort of delicious and dungeon element to it, where like one of the characters is a monster hunter basically, and one of their characters is an alchemist who like, you know, is a chef basically, and works with, you know, what the character, and that creates a sort of synergy right there. And so then, you know, the sort of campaign B stories a lot of times are sort of monster hunting situations where they're hunting on these aberrations. And then I started expanding what the role of the aberrations in the world is. So, you know, it kind of, the process is almost the same, except for, I guess, a little different at the beginning. Just kind of getting on the same page. Because shared assumptions is tricky. This is something with Invisible Sun, I find, you know, is that like there's a lot of, because the world is so different in some ways from our day-to-day experience, you can't assume as much. It's kind of shared of like what, you know, like what it means that, you know, this sun is different from this sun. What's the difference between, you know?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like, and I think a lot of GMs probably, especially experienced GMs, are going to find this. I find it much harder to run in someone else's sandbox, right, than my own.
Yeah.
That's why I tend towards games that have a very loose sense of what the setting is like, and you get to fill in details. Blades in the Dark is a perfect example.
Right.
Duskfall is a fantastic city because it's like they just give you a hint, right? John Harper is amazing at doing this, and he's done it for a number of different projects. Lady Blackbird, he did this one, I think it was just called Ghost, which is a one-page cyberpunk RPG that was sort of like, I don't know if the creators of Morkborg, you know, saw this kind of development, but it's that kind of development where you just have a number of evocative charts, you know, and then you just hang the narrative on these evocative charts.
I wind up feeling like I'm trying to color between the lines, and I'm bad at that.
Are you?
I pretty much never play pre-written adventures, or if I do, I do, but I usually, what I do is I take setting ideas from them and then kind of like adapt that to what's happening with the group that I'm playing with, as opposed to like trying to be like, this thing has to be this way, this thing has to happen, you know. And even when it's not that prescriptive, in D&D as an example, like with the Descent of Avernus, I pulled a lot of like the Mahadi and like this sort of like idea of there being this sort of traveling, you know, kind of bizarre in the hells that also connected to other planes. Like I got that idea from there, but everything else was like, this isn't relevant.
I mean, to say my portion of that game was Dark Sun. This is really just kind of waved the Dark Sun over the concept.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of that campaign was across the multiverse, so it was all about going, you know, I wanted to kind of revisit, you know, it's a little reminiscent of, you know.
But it was like not quite Kryn, not quite Forgotten Realms, not quite, you know, Dark Sun, you know, kind of idea. And we just took, and I'm assuming a lot of like, you know, I'm sure, absolutely certain, in fact, I know people who are like, we're playing in Forgotten Realms and this is the way that it is. And, you know, if you go here, this person's going to be there and this is what their stats are. I don't have the brain power for that kind of thing.
It's just not how it's not how brain, but it's more like my interests don't go in that direction. Like I'm not interested in that, so it's not what I do,
Right. But I do find myself writing content for other worlds. And that is where this becomes a little trickier, right? In that Invisible Sun is a perfect example.
Right.
There's a lot of scaffolding, right? It's particularly hard because in something like your 2025 game, again, you're starting with this very strong concept, right? Of cyberpunk Hong Kong in the future, right? Where Invisible Sun, you don't have a lot to latch onto.
Yeah, no,
right?
That's one thing about the Fallen Cycle games that happen in this world versus in Alteron. Like,
Right.
it definitely is. It is easier because you have those shared things to
Right.
play off of.
Right. And film definitely helps. Like, if you're a big Gaiman or Clive Barker fan, you can, like a Magicka fan, that you can be like, okay, I kind of
right. And then you have to go for the gist. It's not like you're trying to like be true to that world. It's
right. Setting it pretty staunchly in like a 1920s kind of feel, I feel like really helps ground it. And then you can get crazy off of that. Joshua Newman wrote a game called Shock. And Shock did an interesting thing where it was a science fiction game. And it was like, okay, everything's the same. What's the one departure?
Mm-hmm. I love that.
What's the one weird thing? Kind of
I definitely think that way with
and that really helps players relate to these a lot of times very short form games, right? Longer form games you can flounder a little bit, right? Like, get
theory.
Get a feel. Well, they can get a feel. Like your first couple episodes, unless you have a lot of scaffolding, a lot that the GM is sort of like, so for instance, my Invisible Sun game, while it is very character arc driven, I have a premise. I have NPCs that are directing things. This is perfect for, say, a spy game, right? Where, sometimes you see a movie that I hated the beginning of, but I still love the film, is Apocalyptica. Because I hated the idea that the character was just being pulled through the narrative. Like the character had no agency whatsoever. He was just like looking bewildered at everything that went on around him. And I hate games like that.
I should have just cast Keanu Reeves in the role. It would have been fun.
And he goes, whoa.
Yeah.
Hey, no bad mouthing Keanu.
No, I love him, but it's amazing that he makes it work.
Right. But then the character kind of takes over and takes control later on, right? Or I love things that are like, that seems to be happening, only the character is in control the whole time, kind of idea.
Confidence porn.
Right. I love confidence porn.
Has its place, I guess, but it can be a bit much pretty fast.
So these are all ways to kind of manage a player-centric, goal-oriented game. Right? Where sometimes you're taking a little bit of control in the beginning to give the players a foundation to be able to feel like they can walk on and strive, confidently. It's very interesting psychologically as I was doing a lot of my job research into recidivism. The ideas of why someone recidivates goes all the way back to basically how they're being raised. And one of the things that I learned in childhood development was that children develop confidence and grit more often when they have had a foundation of love and support.
Oh, yeah.
When
I don't need a study for that.
Child, well, but you do. Otherwise, you're just talking out your ass, right? But you make good assumptions, right? But this idea that a child who receives unconditional love then can go out and take the world by storm, because I'm guessing is because they have a foundation to come to. And it's the same thing with your players, right? Like if your players know what to expect and understand that the world is there to support them and challenge them, then they can start stretching and they can start, once a player, it's a really fun example. So I was playing Hero Wars and while I love Glorantha, I come from later iterations of Glorantha, right? Where early Glorantha, which is RuneQuest, was very.
That's what I'm more familiar with.
Yeah, was very was very old school D&D, right? For the most part, it was just a fantasy heartbreaker. Is what Glorantha was, right? Really, really well developed world. So you had this very prescribed way that you were in a very particular kind of armor and you were marching through and you saw a bad guy and you stabbed it, right? And like, there's lots of story beyond that, but for the most part, that's the way characters thought of that game. Well, when they changed many, many systems, Glorantha has seen at least a dozen iterations.
Boy.
The Hero Wars version of the iteration spoke to me in a very, very different way. And I came into a campaign a little bit later, and they were all these, I have on my padded mail, and I have my shield, and I have my broadsword, and I'm making sure I have my helm on, and, and so what happens is the first scene that I come into, the PCs are sort of in this kill zone with a set of NPCs on balconies with crossbows. And they're like hiding and cowering behind cover and tables, and they have their shields up, and they're just like, I don't know what to do. My character was a Storm Bull, was sort of combat shaman you could think of. I was covered in like magical woad tattoos. I was like jacked to the nines, and I basically ran up the wall, like leaped over that and just like, beat some crossbowman to death. And you should have seen the players' reaction. They're like, we could do that? Right? And so, I mean, I am as a player, I am not a fun player for some GMs because I'm all about the cinematics. I'm all about like unless you tell me that I can't just run up his spear and kick him in the head, that's how I'm going to play this game, because this is all made up shit, but Hero Wars is a much looser, much more narrative focused game. Mm-hmm. And so what you're bringing to the table is very different than I have these skills, I have this many hit points, sure. that kind of.
And like pushing on the button and, you swing your sword and it does this much damage.
Right. I love wounds. I love death spirals.
Yeah, I do like death spiral, but I like the way, like when you have a system where at least there's consequences for, physical or mental damage or just anything like that. For one thing, it makes it feel more real in the fiction, but also like it makes the group have to make decisions and make different choices. It changes the story. Like
yes.
The whole story can change because someone needs to be protected because they can't walk or something. And that's part of like the group having a cohesion if it's a group style RPGs. And honestly, I've played in a few that weren't like that, but I think that's definitely the norm for it to be like about a group of people who, in one way or another help each other.
Right. I think that's an important part of social contract. And you'll see now that, I start most games going, you're all playing heroes, right? This isn't an evil game.
I don't frame it that way, but I do.
No, but you also run very different games in a lot of respects where that's not the conceit.
Right.
But a lot of the games that we've been playing, right, you're going through a hero's journey. You're trying to be the good guys. You're running through some sort of moral constraint. As compared to now, you don't have to not say that and it mean everybody be bad guys. No. But it does mean that, in terms of like plot and characterization agency, when you don't set those ground rules, you could wind up with at best anti-heroes and at worst villains.
Right. Who, so always a whole episode or 10 on whatever subject, and evil characters is a big one, but the thing is really not about their moral characters so much as whether they can work together or not. Like if you have
Right.
10, quote unquote evil characters who have a common goal, and it's
right, but they have to, for lack of a better term, they have to be lawful evil. They
Right,
can't be chaotic evil.
Right,
Like
yeah.
a bunch of chaotic evil characters, it just becomes a brawl, right? Mm-hmm. or you let that one chaotic evil character in, and then don't be surprised when he like poisons everybody.
Right.
Yeah. Like that's got to be the fitting end to that campaign, and he poisoned all of you. So for plot, a lot of games had been doing this from the get-go. The first one that I had really saw was Burning Wheel. Beliefs and instincts are so powerful. If you don't have an opportunity to play Burning Wheel, I feel like
we should play it together at some point, because I haven't played it.
Yeah, you haven't yet. It is absolute, hands down, my number one favorite system of all times. Right? Yeah, I do. I'm Burning Wheel. On one hand, it just drives games. Like just the idea that, and I take this stuff to I turn it up to 11, right? Like even the designers of Burning Wheel are like, this is not how we play this game. This is how Scott plays this game, because every scene is an opportunity for you to pursue a belief, and again, you're going to see the same thing with character arcs for Invisible Sun, right? Is every scene, how do we showing our characters, our goals? This is what it's about. If you watch something like, say, Good Omens, right? Every scene is about how those characters are pursuing what they want, or how they're stopping someone else from getting what they want,
Or something along those lines.
Or something along those lines, yeah. You can have really great characterization scenes where two characters are getting to know one another. Right. You're getting to know
something about the character.
You learn something about the character. I think that's important. At some point in time, we'll get into Burning Empires. Amazing structured game, way too much for most people, but that's a game where there's literally a scene economy, and the GM and the players are allowed to have certain scenes, and you earn certain scenes that you can either start or the GM gets to, right? And who does so is very, very powerful.
It seems like the kind of thing I could look at some ideas with without being quite as literal with it.
It absolutely.
Usually my way. Yeah.
But then you have interstitial scenes that are not only are they designed to bring in NPCs, because you can't bring in NPCs unless they're in the color first, and items and stuff like that. You can't use the mechanics to build an item with your resources until you bring it into the color. So it's we're having an interstitial scene, and it's well, what are you going to do if the Baron doesn't go along with your plan? And that's the opportunity for me to be and I pat my, blaster and say, he's going to see the business end of this. Now I can build that in the mechanics. Right? Which is, I just think, really powerful and interesting. And part of this idea of, we were talking a couple of episodes ago about the idea of GM saying, do I have to do these things that say the GM's allowed to? And the answer is yes. It's part of social contract. There's this idea that you can do everything. You have a power of the world. Just the floor is lava. At any point in time that you say the floor is lava, I think it's important, right? That mechanics and system and structure.
I think the way that the GM agency, for lack of a better term, I try to be subtle with it. And there are certain things you do control that you don't think about that much, like time, for instance. How much are you slicing up time? Right. Is this, are you narrating I do this, I pick up this thing, I open the door, or is it over the next 12 hours I'm going, and the players have that certain kind of control too, but I think the storyteller or GM, whatever term is being used, has even more control over that. You are a time lord. So
and that brings us to the last piece of agency we wanted to talk about is push-pull of between agency, not only the continuum, but at what point in time the players are in control, at what point in time the GM's in control.
Right. Yeah. I could, it's just, I think just as on account of being like a book and having to put it that way, the book was a little prescriptive in terms of being kind of like, it's either,
a reactive game.
Right. Reactive game or proactive game. So, I think, in a given session or in a given scene, there is a push and pull between that and we've been discussing whether, some systems have it baked into the system where the type of die roll or whatever kind of controls who has the microphone, as it were, and other times where it's kind of more, more plus. I think we've been talking about push and pull really kind of underneath a lot of this conversation.
Well, but I'll be honest, I've been doing this a long time. And something that they said, this idea of reactive role-playing, quite honestly, I hadn't really thought about the idea, because it is how so many of us run games.
Yeah, well, the reactive side of it is, the players are kind of waiting to be delivered sort of the multiple choice question. That's the most extreme version of it, right? Where you're kind of playing kind of a group, choose your own adventure kind of thing where that...
Right, but even, it doesn't even have to be that extreme.
Right, yeah.
Really, honestly, I'll use the word insidious. The idea that all challenges are coming from the GM is really kind of an interesting idea. And Ginni D actually put it interestingly, because she was like, this is why some groups lean towards evil games, is because this idea that heroes are reactive and it's the villains that are proactive.
They can do a lot of the stories where
and I'm like, wow, that's kind of a really interesting idea, that it's true. We're okay, well, it is very rare.
A hero rights a wrong.
Yeah.
Right? The idea, whereas
or prevents a wrong.
Right, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's sort of that was the big innovation to the structure, is not rights a wrong, but is preventing the wrong. That's really eye-opening, honestly, I feel.
Yeah.
Now, granted, I see what you're saying, it doesn't have to be one or the other, right? And we're talking Burning Wheel and the way, and character arcs are a way to run games where, and that the players are driving.
Right.
Everything.
Think of an example, we're talking about the Witch Hunters campaign a little bit, the elements of it that are sort of, based around there being a rebellion happening and the kind of point in history that they are in this world, is kind of is storyteller driven, and the big players kind of, in the world that are kind of doing this witch hunt that is, hunting out people is, that's my
it's this overarching sort of milieu, right? It's how I always envision zombies are usually used.
They're an environmental.
They're just an environmental thing, right? And it's what's going on between the characters is really the important part. And by the way, be careful you don't fail at this role, because at any point in time, a zombie could jump out and bite you.
Yeah, and and it's kind of also, even in terms of it being on rails, that's the way the campaign is in the rails, where I'm driving things forward in that way. But within the sphere of the players in their world, I'm not dictating that.
They're very, very, very broadly used rails, right? Player focused rails.
I think, the world needs to push back, but it's kind of gauging when the world should push back and how is a big, thing. And that's where, for me, it's kind of harder for me to kind of prescribe exactly the way that it's done, because I try to be very much in the context of that, what's happening in the circumstance, whether it's appropriate or not,
And there is a concept of depth, right? Of feeling like you're in a lived world.
Yeah.
Right.
Things are happening without whether or not you. Yeah.
Right. And sometimes players don't care about that. And I think sometimes the setting, it's not that, it can be very isolationist, and it works. Like Rune, right? There was a video game a while ago, and then Robin Laws wrote the game towards Rune, which is very interesting because it's very player focused in that while there are these challenges that are put before you, they literally are scaled to your power level. Right. So a goblin does not have a power level. A goblin is whatever power level the PC is, and plus or minus a little bit. Is this a weaker opponent than the PC, or is this a more powerful opponent than the PC? Is literally gauged off of that centerpiece, right? And you definitely get a sense of who cares if there's a world beyond here, right? And running Rune and playing the video game really opened up my eyes to the idea of how can you create the illusion of a bigger world?
Right. Because that's definitely a big part of it. Is this goes back into what we're talking about world building before. You really, in an ideal world, you're kind of just building out the parts of the world that the characters are going to look at, right. But you don't know that in advance, so you do have to be a little bit more expansive than that. But it's almost where with VR, you have the headset on and looking around with a VR headset and just see where the world is,
Yeah, and that's a lot of power. I don't think GMs understand that power that they have. They are that lens, right? And understanding playing this video game Rune, where you're you could do whatever you want, go ahead, right? But what they do is that the little towns that you're going through fighting these things are ostensibly a dungeon. They don't look it, right? It's same thing with Neverwinter Nights, right? The video game, where it's yes, you have a map, and yes, you could go anywhere you want to in that map, but this map has hard lines, and they're couched there. The illusion is they're closed doors.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so what? You can't hack through them, burn them down, or whatever.
And in RPG, though, it can be much more subtle in the sense of 2054.
Yeah, 54. I said 25.
Yeah, I can see is that it's focused in Hong Kong, but they all had they could buy a plane ticket. They could have gone to Brazil. There was no you have to stay here. But that was the focus of the story, and I think everyone bought into that. They did actually visit Siberia and a couple other places. Went to orbit, but so it's
and you really have to be careful. So I tried to run the first time I tried to run Apocalypse World. I thought I wanted to do kind of a Mad Maxy kind of thing where the game was about getting to the hardhold. It was about getting to the safe place, which is a trope for Apocalypse stuff. It actually didn't work. It actually was really hard to run Apocalypse World in the structure it is. And you don't think about it. You're oh, this should work anywhere. But Apocalypse World really worked well when you started at the place. And then it's all about what goes on in and then externally.
One location.
Right. But that whole traveling perspective didn't really work well, But
interesting. I was just thinking, it made me think for some reason about Star Trek with the conceit of a lot of the first shows was they're on the ship that goes to different places and they go to alien worlds. And that's the format. And they had a real hard time at the beginning of DS9, at least claimed to because it was a fixed location and how do we handle that, And so it was kind of solved both by having things come to them and also by, getting defiant and being able to go to other places.
Right. We could easily be too limited.
Right.
Story-wise.
It's a bottle episode that doesn't end.
Right. Right. But those are very powerful, right? Those sorts of ideas of you're just playing in this Duskfall, right? So our campaign for Blades in the Dark, it's interesting because you're all right, we're just playing in this one city and they have rules for other places. But then what my PCs learned very quickly is no one wants to go there.
Right.
The outside.
From what I know about that place, it's not
terrifying, right? So let's just play here. How about let's not go outside the walls,
it's a conceit within the story that you buy into, but it works, and
And can be fun to be all right, we're going outside, guys. That means something, and playing with that. But there's a lot of power that the GM has in doing that sort of stuff. I've played a bunch of GM-less games. I feel like they work. So one of the things I wanted to talk about in terms of this, GM-less games and the other end of the spectrum, we started at the GM has all total control, right? And the PCs are just like, I do this, I roll the dice, I do. Sometimes what we saw in Stranger Things, the kids, the GM rolled all the dice for everybody, or the D&D episode.
I used to run D&D that way, where the GM rolled everything.
Where the GM rolled everything. The D&D episode in Community, not Community, both Community, but also IT Crowd, which is phenomenal.
I've seen Community. I haven't seen the other one.
Oh, you have never watched IT Crowd? Totally a plug for IT Crowd. Oh my God, it's amazing. You have to watch it. You absolutely have to watch it. But and that's so foreign to me. Like, I watched them play the game this way, and I'm like, oh my God, what are they doing? I'm sure the idea, and it semi-worked, was that it let the players focus more on the story. And it was because because a lot of the players were kind of stuck in this sort of thing. And they said they wanted to do this, but one of these days I'll do it.
Kind of stuck in the sort of like, especially with like D&D, I think we were playing 3rd edition back then, so it was very like all the pieces on the sheet, and you're kind of playing the game that way, and they wanted to have a story, and I'm like, we keep playing and it's no story, and I'm like, hey, let's try it this way, and it worked. The thing is that I think ultimately they still just liked rolling dice too much to give it up, so
really
the story part of it worked, that element of the experiment worked, but the side of it that didn't work, I think, was just that they just like rolling dice.
People do like rolling dice, and making that an exciting part of the game, right?
There's the excitement of rolling the 20 and everyone, jumps out of their seat.
So something that I've taken from a couple games that I really take to heart now, and literally, again, applied to every single game that I run, is that first off, no one has that control, right? Other than setting up the setting, and sometimes we've done that in our session 0, right? Where we start from scratch, we don't know what the fuck we're playing, right? And maybe we're playing a particular system, maybe we're not, where we just go, right? But the key component to this push-pull and how I make this work, and it makes really, in my opinion, really compelling games, is the idea that this is a conversation, and at any point in time, anybody can disagree with a statement. And every statement that you disagree with is just adjudicated by dice.
Okay.
And so I, as the GM, I might talk more than most. In case you haven't noticed, I like to talk. Everything the GM says, the players at any point in time could be like, nope, that's not how it works. And I feel like it's important that we look at RPGs this way, that this is a narrative structure. This is fiction. None of this stuff actually exists.
Sometimes the system is the thing. Like, I'm thinking of Torchbearer in particular, where you're kind of restricted by the system for good. I think for good and sometimes bad, but definitely sometimes for good. More so you don't have to, like, the storyteller isn't doing that. A DM, what do they call it in Torchbearer?
Is it a guide?
Yeah,
I think it might be a guide or a GM, whatever.
Anyways. So it's not coming from, when I'm playing with you, it's not coming from you, it's coming from the rules themselves, right? Kind of like keeping you in that place.
Absolutely. But I think this concept of what I say is not sacrosanct, right? That I'm a firm believer of this idea of nothing exists until it comes to the table, right? Now, you're bringing to the table, this is Hong Kong in 2054, right? We're bringing that to the table already. For my Invisible Sun game, we're bringing to the table, they're part of a secret society that has a leader. That leader, to some degree, is going to be directing some of their efforts. Yeah. You have a boss, right? And that's part of the conceit that everybody is just okay with. At any point in time, somebody could be like, he's not my boss, roll the dice.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes that could be in steps, right? And it's a good GM's or good group's job to meter that out. Maybe that shouldn't just be based on one roll. But if I say the king of Ostlandia comes out and is wearing a purple robe. And somebody's, nope. Actually, I know for a fact that Ostlandian monarchs don't wear purple robes. They have to wear green. I think he's an imposter. I may not have established whether or not in my little notes this is an imposter or not, but this is the point where that is coming to reality or not, you know? And that player sometimes, Burning Wheel actually has a mechanic for this, and it's where I got it. And Luke, I think, hates that I have latched onto this, right? Is they're called wises. And in Burning Wheel, if you have a wise about something in the fiction, you get to decide and make statements about the world like that. So you could have a seneschal that has like really high wise that is like, well, by the way, you're pissing me off and I'm going to make you against the rules. Yep, you are now illegal.
Right.
You know, and holy shit, that changes games, right? Like, yeah. And so I want to give players and GMs both this power, this idea
that the option of playing it that way. You don't have to, but it's, you know.
Sure, but I think it is important to bring on the idea that like fiction shouldn't, only fiction that comes to the table is what should matter. I think is really the important concept, right? Like, backstory that players have secretly drawn out, even like all of the stuff that GMs write out, I feel like shouldn't have the weight that what happens at the table, you know? And that,
I have a hard time with that mostly just because I'm a writer and because so much of what I do, like, you know, creatively winds up being in between sessions, you know, sending people documents or them sending me documents, you know, but then the play, it still has to happen at the table. Kind of, you know, so it's just, yeah, but I mean, I definitely see the value in playing that way because I've been doing it a little while.
You know, and I think problem is with a lot of GMs and players with their backstories, right, get so hung up on this idea of like what they've developed that hasn't been brought to the table. Like,
I mean, definitely the goal is to bring it to the table because otherwise why is it there?
Why is it there? You know? And I've seen...
Not everything comes out.
I've seen so many games where, like, afterwards you do this, like, sort of debrief session of, like, here are the things you never learned. Like, what the fuck am I... Why is that even a thing? You know, kind of idea.
The end campaign reveal can sometimes be a thing, but definitely, you know, it's... yeah.
Yeah. So I just, you know, I want people to like pull back on their ownership of that stuff in an RPG, right? Like, I think if we hold on to that stuff, we limit what could happen, right? In a game where the monarch of Osteria was never planned to be a imposter, right from the get-go, that, like, think about how powerful that is in terms of how that sets the direction of the story, right? Yeah. Where one character knows, holy shit, he's an imposter, you know? And does he tell the other people? And how does he react with the monarch, you know? And now what does that monarch do in the GM's mind, knowing that they're an imposter? And what happened to the original king? Like, holy crap, that just changes how the whole scenario happens. And that is off rails. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about this. I'm like, I'm really trying to think about how I do it. And I'm like, honestly, in the moment, my decision point would probably be whether I think, well, whether I had something planned before or not, whether I think the outcome that's being suggested is more interesting or not.
And
honestly,
right. You know? And who are you? Like, yes, you and I think, really feel like we come up with these good ideas, right? But
yeah, if something's more interesting, I'll go with it.
Yeah.
I'm trying. Anything that's happening around the table is experimental and developmental. It's not, and it's also for fun. So it's not like, you know, I wouldn't want to come to starting a campaign with like these sort of like, all of these things are the facts in the world. They're you know, can't be changed, and you know, they're not.
I had an elven character once that I had not established what the character's name was, Kellyanne,
Mm-hmm.
and I had not established whether or not the character was male or female.
Sure.
Very elvish, very androgynous, and part of the interaction.
I think elf is a gender anyway. So.
Yeah, sure. And a lot of the, this was a group to like group interactions and relationships were actually very important to that group. And there was a lot of conversation about whether or not Kellyanne was a boy or a girl. Mm-hmm. And at some point in time, one of the players was like, I grabbed Kellyanne and kiss him, and or her, whichever it was, right? And that didn't really matter to that group, right? Other than, did this change the way that character thought of their own sexuality? Like, these were important things in these games, and that was a role, right? And when I could have just said yes. And I wasn't the GM, I was a player. Mm-hmm. I could have just said yes. I thought it was much more interesting to be like, let's find out. Nope, it's a girl, and rolled the dice for that sort of thing, and that there was like some tension that built up to that idea, and of course it was important because that character, that there was no homophobia or anything in the group, but that player imagined his character to be heterosexual, and now that he's not, he was like attracted to this other person, added this interesting layer onto him questioning, that sort of stuff in a game where those ideas are important, right? And I think a lot of people are like, no, this character's this way. This street looks like this. There's nothing behind that door, right? And I really challenge GMs and players to let everybody at the table make some of those decisions, or let the dice make that. Mm-hmm. If you feel strongly to hold on to that backstory, bring it to the table. If nobody says it's true or not, right, then it's true. But if somebody challenges it, then they can, oh, I think this is more interesting, or that conflicts with my backstory. Whose backstory was right, So, cool. Anything else you wanted to talk about that?
I think we covered, in a roundabout way, I think we covered a lot, everything I wanted to get onto. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, awesome. About agency anyways, I'm sure it'll come up again in future podcast discussions.
Awesome. Yeah, I think this is a really important part of the stuff that we do and how we think about games, and thank you very much to some of the podcasters and YouTubers who helped us talk about this stuff, and to the book. It's check it out if you are interested in this stuff. Jonah and Tristan Fischel, the Game Master's Handbook of Proactive Role Playing. Whether you agree with it or not, I think particularly for D&D, they have a pretty interesting perspective.
Especially if you haven't thought about these things too much.
Especially if you haven't thought about this stuff. Cool. All right. Thank you.
You have been listening to another episode of the Modern Mythology Podcast. We hope we gave you something new to think about that you can bring to your RPGs, writing, and other character-based games and art forms. Produced by James Kershaw. Soundtrack by Scott Landis and James Kershaw. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.